the hypothalamus is the major control integration center for regulation of homeostasis, right? The major theme of physiology, right? So it's going to encompass all these body parts that you're going to be doing, right? When you get to the respiratory system, when you get to the cardiovascular system, when you get to the digestive system, right? The hypothalamus and this autonomic nervous system will come up again. So it's good to understand it now. It's good to kind of focus this at the end. So the hypothalamus is receiving input, right, from all these. It's a very complex interaction, right? It's getting input from everywhere. It's talking to everything else, like many areas in the brain. So this is central kind of area for regulation of all sorts of systems, right? But it's getting afferent inputs, right, from those sensory cranial nerves, number one, and your taste buds and stuff. But it's also getting all these interoceptors, right, telling you the internal states of your body. It's also receiving really more high-level, complex, emotional kind of related stuff and from your so-called limbic system, right? Anxiety, fear, excitement, all that motivated stuff, behavior is going to interact with the hypothalamus. And the output of the hypothalamus is going to be, multifaceted, right? We already talked about it being the master regulator of the pituitary gland, which itself was a master regulator of the endocrine system. And then today, we'll talk about it as control of your autonomic nervous system. That's stuff that we are not really aware of, but is constantly adjusting all your visceral kind of motor components to maintain a healthy homeostasis. All right, so hypothalamus, major control for homeostasis, integration center. So the inputs, again, you get all these sensory inputs, both stuff you're conscious of and maybe stuff right before you're conscious of, right? Like certain kinds of smell go in there from certain limbic system structures that you're not even aware of, and they cause this like emotional response. But all these, anything that has an emotional component, even if you're, even stuff you're aware of and stuff, is going to be sent to the hypothalamus and your limbic system. And other stuff in the other receptors within the hypothalamus itself is going to monitor body conditions, right? Different kinds of body conditions, which we'll kind of go over a couple examples of that. But it's getting all this input telling you what's going on, what the important things about your body, both conscious and unconscious. So it's being the major regulator. There's about 6 kind of basic things that I ask you to memorize. I'll go over in a couple of detail. Right, we already talked about a little bit about the circadian rhythms, how that pineal gland that was in the back of the thalamus and the epithalamus right there, that secreted melatonin, right? That was receiving, that hypothalamus was receiving light input and kind of regulating your sleep-wake cycles, through that. But then these other ones, production of hormones we talked about with the endocrine. I talked a little bit about this with the limbic system. And then today, our major focus is the autonomic nervous system. And I want to go over these two right here, just a little more detail right here. Right, so not so much eating, which is a little harder to understand, right? But basically hormones in your blood, right, coming from your stomach, telling you that you should be eating, right? Or hormones coming from your, say, pancreas and adipose tissue telling you that you're full, right? It's circulating in the blood, goes through the hypothalamus, and some complicated way that we don't have to understand, right? It promotes eating, right? These feeding centers. It makes you want to eat. It drives this motivated behavior. Or it gives you a sensation that you're full, right? And you're like, I don't need to eat, right? So certain drugs and stuff like kind of feed into this, or rather like stimulate this center or this center and make you feel like really hungry or feel like not eating at all, right? So this is all one of those complicated sort of, motivated and like not emotional per se, but like a feeling that you're aware of, right? you're hungry, you're not hungry. And sometimes it has to do with like, well, how much have you just eaten? How much glucose is in your blood? How much fat is in your blood, and how much your adipose tissue is secreting out, right? But all that is, going to feed into your behavior, right? Regulation of eating. So a little more detail here with drinking, right? Basically your thirst center. There you have this so-called thirst center, certain groups of cells which are going to detect through these so-called osmoreceptors, which I'll talk about in a second here. But basically what they're doing is sensing the level of osmolarity, the osmotic pressure. That is, remember we talked about hypoosmotic and hyperosmotic, or hypertonicity and hypotonicity, the level of solute in the extracellular fluid versus the intracellular fluid. When you're dehydrated, right, your blood, the osmotic pressure in your blood rises because you have more solutes than water than usual, right? So these cells are designed to detect that. And when they do, they send off complicated things that make you, again, like the eating thing, they make you do this thirst-seeking behavior, right? You're just thirsty, right? So you're like thinking of water a lot, like any kind of thing makes you, it makes your mouth dry, all that, right? And all this is making you go and actually go find a glass of water. And the other thing it does, right? Once these cells detect that your blood is the osmotic pressure is rising, it also causes the release of, through the pituitary gland, of that anti-diuretic hormone, right? One of those hormones we talked about when we talked about the endocrine system. And the release of this hormone finds its way to the kidney, which ultimately releases in more water, right? The kidney is, circulating the blood, it's making filtrate, and it could pee out very dilute urine, or it could pee out very concentrated urine. This ADH hormone makes you absorb more water to your body, so your urine is more concentrated, right? So you're reabsorbing the water back into your body. That is going to increase the water level, which is going to decrease, right, the osmolarity pressure, decrease the osmolarity of the blood, right? And then that will give that feedback to stop releasing the ADH. All right, so that's two ways your hypothalamus is going to regulate your sort of water levels, right? And so just, again, if you look at these pictures over here, right, there's two cells in here. One of them is shrunken. One of them is kind of bloated up. Remember we talked about the hypertonicity and hypotonicity, right? When the concentration of salt or solutes was greater in the extracellular fluid, what did that do? It made water leave the cell, right? Through osmosis. It flowed out toward the cell, and that kind of shrank the cell. It caused that departure of water. Whereas if the solute was hypoosmotic, then the water would actually flow in, right? Because the water is going to move toward the area of higher solute concentration. That will cause the cell to swell and affect the response of those receptors. Membrane stretch and everything, and the cell becomes hypotonic or hypertonic. Right? Either when you get this crenulated cell, when it gets smaller, right? That causes an increase in the signals, right? So it's going to cause an increase in action potentials, which is going to release ultimately it's going to cause the release either directly or indirectly, I can't remember, of the ADH, right? But that's what's stimulating that, right? So as opposed to, an input from another cell, putting neurotransmitter on it, it's the actual shrinking and blowing up of the cell, which changes the cell membrane potential, which would cause either an increase or decrease in action potentials based on the tonicity of the surrounding fluid. Right, so this is sort of an integrated example, right? More one of those like things we talked about a long time ago. So this would be a good, like, say, cumulative type of question, right? Because it'll put a lot of stuff together. Right? So that's these osmoreceptors. All right, so that's thirst. right? Based on the water levels in your body, based on the hydration levels, dehydration. Another one is control of your body temperature, right? And so your body temperature has a set kind of point, right? Somewhere over here, which is whatever it is. I know it's like 37 degrees Celsius or something like that. And your body wants to keep it like this, because remember, this is one of those main parameters, right? Those main variables that we need to maintain during homeostasis. If it gets too hot, your enzymes and your cells don't work, right? If it gets too cold, right, your cells start slowing down, right? Your enzymes don't work, right? And so, and everything to be perfect, it's got to be an optimal body temperature. So when you get too hot, right, there are sensors in your body, right, that tell you your blood temperature, your body temperature is too hot. And it undergoes certain processes to cool your body down by maximizing heat loss and minimizing heat production. Vice versa, when you get too cold, right? You want to minimize heat loss, maximize heat production. This could be done, in several different ways. To maximize heat loss, you increase blood flow toward your skin, right? Which is going to release the body heat. You're going to increase sweating and do all that complicated behavior responses, right? The other thing you're going to do is kind of slow down your activity, right? You're hot. You don't feel like doing anything, right? You don't feel like generating a lot of activity in your muscles, which are going to generate heat as a byproduct of that. Or you want to maximize heat production, again, cellular activity, thermogenesis, like shivering. Your muscles are going to move a lot. That generates heat. Other more complicated things is like fat sort of stimulation, metabolism, particular brown fat, which is very interesting. And all of these sort of maybe conscious and unconscious things you start doing when you're cold, right? So these are all ways you can control, and this is all going to be kind of controlled, regulated by the hypothalamus. All right, so in any case, all this is done, right? Your hypothalamus is going to function basically as the thermostat, right? Raise or lower your body temperature. So it's at that main point right here, right? So either again, like dilating blood vessels around the skin and sweating, or the opposite when it's too cold, right? And that'll all be fed in through the hypothalamus, controlling these, which we'll see a lot of through the autonomic nervous system itself. So a lot of these are actually part of the autonomic nervous system, but we're labeling these as a little bit something separate. All right, so again, this is just another graph of this for people who like this type better, but main point, hypothalamic regulatory center is going to stimulate all this to maintain homeostasis. Those two, like eating, drinking, to body temperature, and then with the other function we already discussed in our endocrine system was that your master regulator of your pituitary gland was the hypothalamus. And, part of that because the anterior lobe, right, was controlled by those releasing and inhibiting hormones, controlling those hormones, right? So you're sent off inhibiting or releasing hormones in your anterior ones on to release and stimulate the thyroids, the adrenal cortex, the gonads, right? So this was kind of regulating the output of the anterior lobe of the pituitary. It also had its own hormones made. And we just talked about ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which controlled water retention or water absorption, right? As well as oxytocin. This you'll cover in reproductive system. This you'll cover in the urinary system. And so these will come up again. You'll cover some of these, I'm sure, the anterior ones. That's your endocrine gland connection right there. And again, some of these are cross, right? I just talked about ADH. So it's kind of that thirst regulation, water retention is related to this right here. So they're not separately, totally separate, entirely separate functions. And then there's the really complicated one, right? Working with the limbic system, that emotional brain, right? As well as other parts that regulate your so-called motivated behavior, right? And this is, again, psychological stuff. If you take psychology, right, you learn about the 4 F's, right? which is right, feeding, things that make you hungry and go seek food seeking behavior, right? Fighting, when you are trying to fight off an aggressor, fighting for your life, or if you're scared, fleeing, right? All these are the kind of motivated behaviors based on your need to survive or reproduce, right? So your reproductive behavior is also all that complex reproductive behavior, right, is going to be part of that motivated behavior, right? That is all happening, right? Very complex again, but the bottom line is that your hypothalamic, right, is a major sort of integrating center for this. It's also really going to be the major output of the limbic system, right, over here to kind of mediate the effects of these motivated behaviors, right? Really tie into the emotional kind of center of your brain, which we already talked about with the limbic system, because the hypothalamic nuclei, basically all your limbic system structures like anxiety, memory, all these other competing things like inhibitory things, emotional brains fighting with your prefrontal cortex reasoning center, all that stuff was fighting basically for control of your hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus was going to actually be your like emotional, your visceral kind of component of those emotions. Again, kind of complicated like to think about, especially if you haven't like taken psychology or whatever, but I mean, this is maybe a good quote to kind of get what I'm saying. You know, emotions is, again, hard to describe what you mean by emotions, but you know, this quote is kind of getting to like, what do you mean by emotions if you don't have these visceral things, like your heartbeat is beating fast, like you're breathing fast, right? You're trembling like in your lips, you're weak, you know, your limbs, you get goosebumps, right? All these kind of things, you can feel those, right? Those are going to be associated with things like anger or fear or something like that, with those emotions, right? That, right? So, you know, there's a long-standing debate. Can you even separate what we say are emotions from these actual bodily feelings, right? And all these bodily feelings like this, heartbeat, breathing, like your muscle shakings and stuff like that, your fact that you're, you know, feeling your goosebumps and stuff like that, right? Or all these are going to be parts of your autonomic nervous system output, which is controlled by the hypothalamus, right? So that's what we mean by the visceral output of the limbic system. So then the last part here will relate to what we are talking about today, right? The autonomic nervous system. And your autonomic nervous system, of course, has these two components, right? The sympathetic, parasympathetic. So your hypothalamus has certain cells in there, which are going to receive certain, you know, input, and they're going to control basically those two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, as well as other stuff, particular in the brain, in the midbrain, pons, and medulla, right? In your brain stem right there. So the hypothalamus over there through these nuclei, besides doing all these crazy things. I mean, look at some of these, right? You stimulate this little nuclei right here, and you just go crazy and just eat, and like attack other things, right? What else? What other weird ones, right? You stimulate this one, and you know you're stimulated to eat. You destroy it, and you just don't want to eat anymore. What else? Destruction result. If you destroy this one you stimulate, it results in obesity. And if you destroy it, it results in obesity and set behavior, right? So very weird, kind of complicated stuff. But these, you know, they're going to be what we'll talk about today, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So we'll talk about its role in that and then move on to the autonomic nervous system. All right, we'll see you next time.